Hello, everyone. In the vast expanse of human history, few phenomena have shaped civilization as profoundly as the network of trade routes we now call the Silk Road. Picture, if you will, the year 138 BCE, when a young Chinese diplomat named Zhang Qian embarked on what would become one of history's most consequential journeys. The Han Emperor Wu had dispatched him westward with a mission that seemed almost impossible: to forge alliances with distant peoples against the threatening Xiongnu nomads who constantly raided China's northern borders. Zhang Qian's expedition would take him far beyond the familiar boundaries of the Middle Kingdom, through treacherous mountain passes, across endless deserts, and into lands where strange languages echoed through bustling marketplaces filled with exotic goods. Little did he know that his diplomatic mission would inadvertently lay the groundwork for a commercial network that would connect East and West for over 15 centuries. The term Silk Road itself is relatively modern, coined by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. Yet the roots Zhang Qian helped establish were ancient pathways that had been traveled by merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers long before his time. These weren't single roads, but rather a complex web of interconnected routes stretching roughly 4,000 miles from the bustling markets of Chang'an, the Tang Dynasty capital, to the Mediterranean ports of Antioch and Constantinople. As Zhang Qian journeyed westward, he encountered the Fergana Valley, where magnificent horses that seemed to sweat blood captured his imagination. These powerful steeds, later known as heavenly horses to the Chinese, would become one of the most prized commodities, flowing eastward along the Silk Road. The Chinese court's desire for these animals was so intense that it would later spark military campaigns and diplomatic missions that further solidified the trade connections Zhang Qian had pioneered. But the Silk Road was never just about silk, despite its name. From its earliest days, this network carried a dazzling array of goods that reflected the diverse needs and desires of civilizations separated by thousands of miles. Chinese silk, with its lustrous beauty and incredible lightness, did indeed flow westward in enormous quantities, but it traveled alongside precious jade, exotic spices, fine porcelain, and innovative technologies like papermaking and gunpowder. Moving in the opposite direction came equally valuable treasures: Roman glassware that sparkled like captured sunlight, precious metals from the mines of Central Asia, aromatic frankincense, and myrrh from Arabian Peninsula, and most significantly, the horses that had so captivated Zhang Qian's attention. These exchanges weren't merely commercial transactions, but cultural dialogues that would reshape entire civilizations. The geography itself seemed designed to facilitate this grand exchange. The route began in the fertile Wei River Valley, where Chang'an served as the eastern terminus. From there, travelers would head northwest through the Hexi Corridor, a narrow strip of habitable land squeezed between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north. This corridor served as a natural funnel, channeling trade traffic through a series of oasis towns that became vital stopping points for merchant caravans. Dunhuang, situated at the western end of the Hexi Corridor, emerged as one of the most important of these oasis settlements. Here, the main route split into northern and southern branches that skirted the forbidding Taklamakan Desert. The northern route passed through cities like Turpan and Kashgar, while the southern route connected oases such as Khotan and Yarkand. Both branches eventually converged again in the west, near the great trading center of Merv in present-day Turkmenistan. The challenges facing merchants on these routes were extraordinary. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name supposedly means "go," in and you won't come out, presented a particularly daunting obstacle. Sandstorms could arise without warning, burying entire caravans beneath shifting dunes. Water was scarce and precious, forcing travelers to plan their journeys carefully from oasis to oasis. The extreme temperatures, scorching by day and freezing by night, tested human endurance to its limits. Yet it wasn't just the physical environment that posed challenges. Political instability along the routes could make the difference between profitable trade and complete disaster. Local rulers might impose heavy taxes or simply confiscate entire loads of goods. Bandits haunted certain stretches of the route, particularly in mountainous regions where caravans were most vulnerable. The constant threat of warfare between competing kingdoms could close trade routes for months or even years at a time. Despite these dangers, the potential profits were enormous enough to attract countless merchants willing to risk everything for a successful trading expedition. A bolt of Chinese silk that cost relatively little in Chang'an might sell for 50 times its original price in Rome. Similarly, Roman gold coins were so valued in China that they often circulated as currency in their own right, prized not just for their metal content but as symbols of distant lands and exotic trade connections. The logistics of organizing a trading expedition were incredibly complex. Merchants rarely attempted to traverse the entire length of the Silk Road themselves. Instead, goods changed hands multiple times as they moved from east to west or west to east. A Chinese merchant might sell his silk to a Central Asian trader in Kashgar, who would then transport it to Merv, where it might be purchased by a Persian merchant for the final leg to Mediterranean markets. This system of relay trading meant that each segment of the route developed its own specialized knowledge and networks. Local guides who knew every water source, every safe camping spot, and every potential danger became invaluable assets. These guides often came from nomadic tribes who had intimate knowledge of the desert and mountain environments that formed the backbone of the Silk Road network. The camels that carried these precious cargoes were themselves marvels of natural engineering, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of Central Asian trade routes. The two-humped Bactrian camels used on the northern routes could carry loads of up to 500 pounds while surviving for days without water. Their thick fur protected them from both extreme cold and heat, while their broad, padded feet prevented them from sinking into sand or snow. A typical caravan might include anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred camels, along with a proportional number of merchants, guards, and support personnel. The organization required to coordinate such expeditions was sophisticated, involving careful planning of routes, timing, supplies, and security arrangements. Caravans often traveled together for mutual protection, creating temporary communities that might include people from dozens of different ethnic groups and cultural backgrounds. As these diverse groups traveled together across the vast distances of the Silk Road, they inevitably shared more than just commercial interests. Languages mixed and evolved, creating new forms of communication that facilitated trade across cultural boundaries. Religious ideas spread along the same routes as commercial goods, with Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and other faiths finding new audiences far from their places of origin. The Buddhist monk Xuanzang, who traveled from China to India in the 7th century CE to collect Buddhist scriptures, left detailed accounts of his journey that provide invaluable insights into Silk Road life during the Tang Dynasty period. His descriptions of the cities, peoples, and customs he encountered paint a vivid picture of a world connected by trade, but incredibly diverse in its local variations. From Xuanzang's writings, we learn about the cosmopolitan nature of major silk road cities like Samarkand, where merchants from China, India, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire mingled in bustling bazaars filled with goods from across the known world. These cities became melting pots of culture, where architectural styles, artistic techniques, culinary traditions, and intellectual ideas merged in fascinating combinations. The Tang Dynasty period, spanning from 618 to 907 CE, represented the absolute pinnacle of Silk Road trade and cultural exchange. During these nearly 3 centuries, the Chinese Empire reached unprecedented levels of prosperity and cosmopolitan sophistication, largely fueled by the wealth flowing through the great trade arteries that connected East and West. The Tang capital of Chang'an, with a population exceeding 1 million inhabitants, stood as the largest city in the world, a glittering metropolis where merchants from distant lands conducted business in dozens of different languages. Under Tang rule, the Chinese government actively promoted and protected Silk Road commerce through a sophisticated system of diplomatic relations and military garrisons. The empire extended its influence far into Central Asia, establishing a network of protectorates and allied kingdoms that provided security for merchant caravans traveling the dangerous desert routes. Chinese military outposts, staffed by professional soldiers and equipped with the latest military technology, were strategically positioned at key points along the trade routes to deter bandits and enforce imperial authority. The Tang emperors understood that the Silk Road represented far more than a source of luxury goods for the imperial court. The customs duties and taxes collected from Silk Road commerce provided a substantial portion of the imperial treasury's revenues, funding everything from massive construction projects to military campaigns that further expanded Chinese power and influence. The economic benefits of controlling the Silk Road were so significant that they became a central focus of Tang foreign policy throughout the dynasty's existence. During this golden age, the variety and volume of goods flowing along the Silk Road reached unprecedented levels. Chinese exports extended far beyond the famous silk textiles to include tea, which was just beginning to gain popularity in Central Asian markets. Fine porcelain that amazed Western buyers with its translucent beauty and various manufactured goods that demonstrated Chinese technological superiority. Chinese artisans had perfected techniques for producing silk fabrics of extraordinary quality, from heavy brocades woven with gold thread to gossamer light, gauzes that seemed to float like captured mist. The Chinese monopoly on silk production was jealously guarded, with severe penalties imposed on anyone who attempted to smuggle silkworms or reveal the secrets of silk cultivation to foreigners. This monopoly ensured that Chinese silk commanded premium prices throughout the ancient world, making it one of the most profitable commodities in international trade. Roman writers complained about the enormous amounts of gold flowing eastward to pay for Chinese silk, leading some to worry about the empire's balance of trade with distant Asian lands. But the flow of goods moving eastward into China was equally impressive and economically significant. The heavenly horses from Fergana remained among the most prized imports, with the Tang court maintaining thousands of these magnificent animals for both military and ceremonial purposes. These horses were so valued that they featured prominently in Tang art and poetry, becoming symbols of imperial power and exotic luxury. From the Islamic world came a dazzling array of goods that catered to Chinese tastes for the exotic and luxurious. Persian carpets, renowned for their intricate patterns and superior craftsmanship, adorned the homes of wealthy Chinese merchants and officials. Arabian perfumes and cosmetics found eager buyers among fashionable Tang Dynasty women, while precious stones like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan were incorporated into Chinese jewelry and decorative arts. the spice trade formed another crucial component of eastward commerce. Pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, and other aromatic spices not only enhanced Chinese cuisine, but also served medicinal purposes in traditional Chinese medicine. Some spices were so valuable that they were literally worth their weight in silver, making them ideal trade goods for merchants willing to transport small, high-value cargoes across the dangerous desert routes. Glass technology, which had been perfected in Romang and later Islamic workshops, created objects that fascinated Chinese consumers. Roman glassware, with its clarity and brilliant colors, was considered almost magical by Chinese buyers who were accustomed to pottery and bronze vessels. Islamic glassmakers later developed even more sophisticated techniques, producing intricate glass objects that became treasured possessions in Chinese households. The monetary systems that facilitated this vast commercial network were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Chinese copper coins served as a standard currency along much of the eastern portion of the Silk Road, while Islamic silver dirhams dominated trade in Central Asian markets. Gold remained the ultimate store of value, with Roman and Byzantine gold coins circulating widely as symbols of international commerce and prestige. Credit systems developed to facilitate long-distance trade, allowing merchants to deposit funds in one city and withdraw equivalent amounts in distant markets. This early form of banking reduced the risks associated with carrying large amounts of precious metals across dangerous territories. Islamic merchants, in particular, developed sophisticated financial instruments that made long-distance trade more practical and profitable. The cities that served as major commercial centers along the Silk Road during the Tang period became some of the most cosmopolitan places on Earth. Samarkand, strategically located at the crossroads of multiple trade routes, grew into a magnificent city whose bazaars offered goods from across the known world. Travelers described markets where Chinese silk hung beside Indian cottons, where Persian silver vessels shared display space with Roman glassware, and where spices from Southeast Asia perfumed the air alongside incense from Arabian Peninsula. These commercial centers developed unique cultural characteristics that reflected their position at the intersection of different civilizations. Architecture incorporated elements from multiple traditions, creating distinctive styles that blended Chinese roof designs with Islamic decorative patterns and Central Asian structural techniques. The result was a built environment that visually represented the cultural mixing taking place in these international commercial hubs. Language evolution in these multilingual trading centers created fascinating linguistic phenomena. Trade languages, or lingua francas, developed to facilitate communication between merchants who spoke completely different native languages. These simplified communication systems borrowed vocabulary from multiple languages while developing standardized terms for commercial transactions, weights and measures, and common trade goods. The religious landscape of Silk Road cities during the Tang period reflected the same diversity and mixing that characterized their commercial life. Buddhist monasteries served not only as centers of religious worship but also as hostels for traveling merchants, libraries for preserving important documents, and even banks for storing valuables and conducting financial transactions. Christian communities, following Nestorian traditions, established churches and trading networks that connected Central Asian cities with Christian communities in distant lands. Islamic merchants, whose commercial networks extended from Spain to Southeast Asia, brought not only goods but also religious and intellectual traditions that gradually gained influence in Central Asian cities. The process of Islamic conversion in these regions was often gradual and peaceful. facilitated by the practical advantages of joining established Muslim trading networks rather than through military conquest. Zoroastrian communities, representing one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, maintained their ancient traditions while adapting to the commercial realities of Silk Road trade. Many Zoroastrian families became successful merchants, using their extensive kinship networks to facilitate long-distance commerce across the Iranian plateau and into Central Asia. The technological innovations that spread along the Silk Road during the Tang period had profound impacts on world history. Papermaking, invented in China, gradually spread westward, revolutionizing record-keeping and communication throughout the Islamic world and eventually reaching Europe. The technology of printing, also developed in China, began its slow journey westward during this period, though it would take centuries to reach its full potential in distant lands. Gunpowder, another Chinese invention, started its world-changing journey westward during the late Tang period. Initially used for fireworks and signal devices, the military applications of gunpowder would eventually transform warfare across Eurasia. The compass, crucial for navigation, also began its spread from China during this era, eventually enabling the great oceanic voyages that would reshape global trade patterns. Agricultural innovations moved along the Silk Road alongside manufactured goods and precious commodities. New crops adapted to different climatic conditions allowed farming communities to increase their productivity and support larger populations. Techniques for irrigation, food preservation, and animal husbandry spread between regions, contributing to agricultural improvements that supported the growing cities and trading centers along the routes. Medical knowledge formed another crucial category of Silk Road exchange during the Tang period. Chinese medical texts, describing acupuncture techniques and herbal remedies, found their way into Islamic medical libraries, where they were translated and integrated with Greek and Persian medical traditions. Similarly, Islamic medical knowledge, building on Greek foundations, influenced Chinese medical practice and contributed to the development of new therapeutic approaches. The artistic cross-pollination that occurred along the Silk Road during this golden age created some of history's most remarkable cultural artifacts. Chinese artists incorporated Central Asian and Middle Eastern decorative motifs into their work, while craftsmen in Samarkand and other trading cities adapted Chinese artistic techniques to create unique fusion styles. The result was an explosion of artistic creativity that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Silk Road civilization. The name Marco Polo has become synonymous with the Silk Road in the Western imagination, and for good reason. His extraordinary journey from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century opened European eyes to the vast riches and sophisticated civilizations that lay beyond their familiar Mediterranean world. But to understand the full significance of Marco Polo's adventures, we must first examine the remarkable transformation that had occurred along the Silk Road during the period of Mongol dominance, which created the conditions that made his epic journey possible. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, while initially devastating to many settled civilizations, ultimately created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance trade and cultural exchange. Under Mongol rule, a single political authority controlled territory stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, eliminating many of the political barriers that had previously hindered Silk Road commerce. The Mongol concept of the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, established security conditions that allowed merchants to travel safely across vast distances without fear of warfare between competing kingdoms. Mongol rulers actively promoted trade as a source of revenue for their Vast empires. They standardized weights and measures across their territories, established efficient postal relay systems that facilitated communication, and implemented legal codes that protected merchant rights and property. These innovations created a more predictable and secure environment for long-distance commerce than had existed for centuries along the Silk Road routes. When Marco Polo embarked on his journey to the East in 1271, accompanied by his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo, he was following routes that had been traveled by Polo family merchants for several years already. The elder Paulos had made an earlier journey to the Mongol court, where they had been received by Kublai Khan himself and commissioned to return with Christian missionaries and sacred oil from Jerusalem. This earlier expedition had established the family's credentials as reliable trading partners and diplomatic intermediaries. The route taken by the Paulos differed somewhat from the classical Silk Road paths, reflecting both the political realities of their time and the specific opportunities available to Italian merchants in the late 13th century. Starting from Venice, they traveled by sea to the port of Acre in the Holy Land, then overland through Anatolia and Persia, before joining the traditional Central Asian routes that led to China. Marco Polo's detailed descriptions of this journey, preserved in his famous book Il Malione, provide invaluable insights into Silk Road conditions during the height of Mongol power. His accounts of cities like Tabriz, which he described as a great commercial center where merchants from India and Europe met to exchange goods, illustrate the cosmopolitan nature of Silk Road trade during this period. According to Polo, Tabriz's markets offered an incredible variety of goods, from precious stones and pearls to silk fabrics and spices, all traded by merchants who spoke dozens of different languages. The city of Hormuz, at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, particularly impressed Marco Polo, with its role as a major hub for maritime trade connecting the Indian Ocean with the overland Silk Road routes. He described vast warehouses filled with goods from India, including precious stones, pearls, silk fabrics, elephant tusks, and various spices. The sophisticated commercial infrastructure he observed in Hormuz reflected centuries of development. In long-distance trading systems as the Paulos traveled through Central Asia, Marco's observations revealed the remarkable diversity of peoples and cultures that had developed along the Silk Road. In the city of Balkh, which he called the mother of cities, he encountered the ruins of ancient greatness alongside bustling contemporary commerce. His descriptions of Samarkand emphasize its role as a center for craftsmen and artisans who produced goods specifically for the international trade market. The desert crossing that took the Paulos across the Taklamakan Desert provided Marco with first-hand experience of the dangers and hardships that Silk Road merchants had faced for centuries. His vivid descriptions of desert mirages, dangerous sandstorms, and the constant threat of getting lost in the shifting dunes captured the psychological as well as physical challenges of Silk Road travel. Yet he also noted the sophisticated systems of guides and supply caches that allowed experienced merchants to navigate these dangerous routes successfully. Upon reaching China, Marco Polo entered a world that far exceeded European expectations of wealth and sophistication. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan after the Mongol conquest of the Song dynasty, had created a unified Chinese empire that controlled territory from Korea to Tibet. The Mongol rulers had adopted many Chinese administrative practices, while maintaining their own distinct cultural identity, creating a unique fusion civilization that fascinated foreign visitors. Kublai Khan's capital at Kambalik, modern-day Beijing, amazed Marco Polo with its size and splendor. He described a city larger than any in Europe, with wide streets, magnificent palaces, and markets that offered goods from across the known world. The Imperial Palace complex, with its elaborate gardens and countless rooms decorated with gold and precious stones, represented a level of luxury that seemed almost beyond belief to a medieval European visitor. During his 17 years in China, Marco Polo claimed to have served Kublai Khan in various administrative capacities, giving him unique insights into the workings of Mongol administration and Chinese civilization. His descriptions of Chinese technological innovations, including the use of paper money, coal for fuel, and sophisticated postal systems, introduced European readers to concepts that were completely foreign to their experience. The paper money system particularly fascinated Marco Polo, who understood its revolutionary implications for long-distance trade. In Europe, commerce still depended heavily on the physical exchange of gold and silver coins, making large transactions cumbersome and dangerous. The Chinese system of government-issued paper currency, backed by imperial authority and accepted throughout the empire, represented a sophisticated financial innovation that wouldn't be adopted in Europe for centuries. Marco Polo's accounts of Chinese cities like Hangzhou, which he called Qinsai, paint pictures of urban sophistication that rivaled or exceeded anything in the medieval European world. He described markets that operated around the clock, serving a population that he estimated at over 1 million inhabitants. The variety of goods available in these markets, from fresh seafood brought daily from the coast to exotic fruits and vegetables from distant provinces, illustrated the sophisticated supply systems that supported these great urban centers. The silk production centers that Marco Polo visited revealed the continuing importance of this traditional Chinese industry to Silk Road commerce. He described vast workshops where hundreds of workers produced silk fabrics of extraordinary quality and beauty. The variety of silk products, from heavy brocades suitable for imperial robes to delicate gauzes that seemed to capture light itself, demonstrated the technological sophistication of Chinese textile production. But silk was no longer the only significant Chinese export flowing westward along the Silk Road routes. Marco Polo noted the importance of tea, which was beginning to gain popularity in Central Asian markets, and various manufactured goods that demonstrated Chinese technological superiority. Porcelain, in particular, amazed foreign buyers with its translucent beauty and remarkable durability. The return journey of the Polos, undertaken partly by sea through Southeast Asian waters, reflected the changing patterns of Silk Road trade during the late 13th century. Maritime routes connecting China with Indian Ocean ports had become increasingly important, offering alternatives to the traditional overland routes across Central Asia. This maritime dimension of Silk Road commerce would become increasingly significant in subsequent centuries. Marco Polo's descriptions of Southeast Asian ports like Sumatra and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, reveal sophisticated trading networks that connected the South China Sea with Indian Ocean commerce. These maritime routes carried many of the same goods that had traditionally moved overland, but they also facilitated trade in bulkier commodities like rice, timber, and various tropical products that were impractical to transport across desert routes. The impact of Marco Polo's book on European understanding of Asia cannot be overstated. His detailed descriptions of Chinese wealth and technological sophistication challenged European assumptions about their own civilization's superiority. The geographic knowledge contained in his accounts influenced map-making and exploration planning for centuries, contributing to the eventual European voyages of discovery that would establish direct maritime connections between Europe and Asia. However, Marco Polo's journey also occurred during a period when the conditions that had made his travels possible were beginning to change. The Mongol Empire was fragmenting into competing khanates, reducing the security and political unity that had facilitated long-distance trade. The rise of the Ming Dynasty in China, which expelled the Mongols and established a more isolationist foreign policy, would further restrict the opportunities for foreign merchants to access Chinese markets. The religious and cultural exchanges that Marco Polo witnessed during his travels illustrate the continuing importance of the Silk Road as a conduit for ideas as well as goods. He encountered Nestorian Christian communities in Central Asian cities, Buddhist monasteries that served as centers of learning and commerce, and Islamic institutions that facilitated both religious and commercial activities. This religious diversity reflected centuries of cultural exchange along the Silk Road routes. The technological innovations that Marco Polo observed in China would eventually transform European civilization, though the process of transmission often took centuries to complete. Printing technology, which he encountered in Chinese cities, would eventually revolutionize European learning and communication. Gunpowder, which he observed being used for both military and ceremonial purposes, would transform European warfare and contribute to the rise of powerful centralized states. The rise of Islamic civilization in the 7th and 8th centuries CE created a new dynamic along the Silk Road that would profoundly influence both trade patterns and intellectual development across Eurasia. As Arab armies conquered vast territories stretching from Spain to Central Asia, they didn't merely impose political control. They created a unified cultural and commercial zone that facilitated unprecedented levels of scholarly exchange and economic integration along the ancient trade routes. The Islamic concept of trade as a divinely blessed activity, rooted in the Prophet Muhammad's own background as a merchant, created cultural attitudes that strongly supported commercial activities. Islamic law, or Sharia, developed sophisticated commercial regulations that protected merchant rights, standardized business practices, and established mechanisms for resolving trade disputes. These legal innovations made Islamic territories particularly attractive to merchants from all backgrounds, whether Muslim or not. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled the Islamic world from 750 to 1258 CE, established its capital at Baghdad in a location that was strategically chosen to take advantage of existing trade routes. Situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Baghdad became a natural convergence point for goods flowing between Asia and Europe, while its position also allowed easy access to maritime trade through the Persian Gulf. Within a century of its founding, Baghdad had grown into one of the world's largest cities, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million inhabitants. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid in the early 9th century, became the most important center of learning in the medieval world. This remarkable institution served as a library, translation center, and research academy where scholars from across the known world collaborated on projects that advanced human knowledge. In mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and geography, the scholars working in the House of Wisdom had access to texts and ideas that flowed along the Silk Road, from as far away as China and India. The translation movement that centered in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries represents one of history's most significant intellectual achievements. Teams of scholars, many of them Christians and Jews working under Islamic patronage, translated thousands of Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese texts into Arabic. This massive translation effort preserved classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost while making it accessible to scholars throughout the Islamic world. Chinese texts on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were among the works translated. During this period, introducing Islamic scholars to sophisticated Chinese scientific and technical knowledge. The Chinese invention of paper, which had gradually spread westward along the Silk Road, made this translation movement practical by providing an affordable writing material that could be produced in large quantities. The paper mill established in Baghdad in the late 8th century was one of the first outside of China. Islamic merchants developed some of the most extensive and sophisticated trading networks in medieval history, with commercial connections that stretched from Islamic Spain to Southeast Asia and from the steppes of Central Asia to the coasts of East Africa. These networks carried much more than simple trade goods. They served as conduits for the transmission of scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and cultural practices across vast distances. The city of Merv, located in present-day Turkmenistan, emerged as one of the most important Islamic centers along the Silk Road during this period. Strategically positioned at the convergence of multiple trade routes, Merv became a major commercial hub where merchants from China, India, the Middle East, and Europe met to exchange goods and ideas. The city's libraries and schools attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, making it a center of learning that rivaled Baghdad itself. Islamic mathematicians made crucial contributions to the development of algebra, trigonometry, and other mathematical fields, often building on knowledge that had reached them through Silk Road connections. The Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad during the 9th century, developed algebraic methods that incorporated mathematical techniques from both Greek and Indian sources. His work on algebra and arithmetic would later be transmitted to Europe, where it would form the foundation for Renaissance mathematical developments. Astronomical knowledge also advanced significantly through the collaboration of Islamic scholars with ideas and observations that had traveled along the Silk Road from Chinese and Indian sources. Islamic astronomers established observatories in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Samarkand, where they made precise observations that improved upon earlier Greek and Chinese astronomical works. The astrolabe, perfected by Islamic craftsmen, became an essential navigational tool that facilitated both overland and maritime trade. The medical knowledge that circulated along Islamic Silk Road networks represented a synthesis of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese medical traditions. The great physician Al-Razi, working in Baghdad during the 10th century, wrote comprehensive medical texts that incorporated therapeutic approaches from multiple traditions. His clinical observations and experimental methods represented significant advances in medical practice that would influence physicians throughout the medieval world. Islamic geographical knowledge expanded dramatically through the reports of merchants, pilgrims, and travelers who used Silk Road routes to reach distant destinations. The geographer Al-Idrisi, working in 12th century Sicily, compiled one of the most accurate world maps of the medieval period, incorporating information from Islamic merchants who had traveled as far as China and Southeast Asia. These geographical works provided crucial information for subsequent trading expeditions and diplomatic missions. The role of Islamic scholars in transmitting Chinese technological innovations to the West cannot be overstated. Gunpowder, which had been invented in China for fireworks and signaling devices, was adapted by Islamic military engineers for use in early cannons and other weapons. The compass, another Chinese invention, was refined by Islamic navigators for use in both overland and maritime navigation. Paper manufacturing techniques, originally developed in China, were improved by Islamic craftsmen who established paper mills throughout the Middle East and North Africa. The textile industries that developed in Islamic cities along the Silk Road created products that competed successfully with Chinese silk in international markets. Cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Isfahan became renowned for producing silk fabrics, cotton textiles, and other luxury goods that incorporated both local traditions and techniques learned through Silk Road exchanges. The famous damask silk, named after Damascus, represented a fusion of Chinese silk weaving techniques with Islamic decorative traditions. Islamic artisans also excelled in metalworking, glassmaking, and ceramic production, creating luxury goods that were highly valued in both Eastern and Western markets. The sophisticated inlay techniques developed by Islamic metalworkers, which incorporated silver and gold decorations into brass and bronze objects, produced works of art that were treasured by collectors from China to Europe. Islamic glassmakers, building on Roman techniques, created innovative products that influenced glass production throughout the medieval world. The banking and credit systems developed by Islamic merchants were crucial to the expansion of Silk Road commerce during this period. Islamic commercial law permitted various forms of credit and partnership arrangements that made long-distance trade more practical and profitable. The Hawala system, which allowed merchants to transfer funds across great distances without physically moving gold or silver, reduced both the risks and costs associated with long-distance commerce. Islamic cities along the Silk Road developed distinctive architectural styles that reflected their cosmopolitan character and commercial prosperity. The great mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais built during this period incorporated decorative elements and structural techniques from multiple traditions, creating architectural syntheses that visually represented the cultural mixing that characterized Silk Road civilization. The caravanserai, or roadside inn, became a distinctive feature of Islamic Silk Road architecture. These fortified compounds provided secure accommodation for merchant caravans, with facilities for both humans and animals, storage areas for goods, and often commercial spaces where trading could take place. The network of caravanserais that developed along Islamic Silk Road routes made long-distance travel safer and more comfortable, encouraging the expansion of trade. Islamic scholars also made significant contributions to the development of chemistry, building on earlier alchemical traditions while incorporating new knowledge gained through Silk Road connections. The Persian scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan, working in the 8th century, developed experimental techniques and theoretical frameworks that advanced chemistry as a scientific discipline. His work influenced both Islamic and later European developments in chemistry and metallurgy. The philosophical exchanges that occurred along Islamic Silk Road networks created new synthetic approaches to understanding reality that incorporated elements from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese philosophical traditions. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Averroes developed philosophical systems that attempted to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Islamic theology while incorporating insights from other philosophical traditions encountered through Silk Road cultural exchanges. The gradual decline of the overland Silk Road represents one of history's most significant economic and cultural transformations. This decline wasn't sudden or complete. It occurred over several centuries and resulted from a complex interplay of political, technological, and economic factors that fundamentally altered global trade patterns. Understanding this transformation requires examining both the internal developments within Silk Road regions and the external innovations that offered alternative pathways for international commerce. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire in the late 13th and early 14th centuries marked the beginning of the end for the classical Silk Road system. The unified political control that had facilitated safe, Passage across vast distances dissolved into competing khanates that often fought among themselves. These political divisions reintroduced the border controls, taxation disputes, and security. Problems that had made Silk Road travel dangerous and expensive before the Mongol conquests. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries created additional complications for traditional Silk Road commerce. While the Ottomans controlled crucial segments of the Western Silk Road routes, they imposed heavy taxes and regulations on goods passing through their territories. European merchants, who had previously been able to access Asian goods through relatively stable Middle Eastern intermediaries, found themselves facing increasingly expensive and uncertain trading conditions simultaneously. The Ming Dynasty's establishment in China in 1368 brought significant changes to the eastern terminus of the Silk Road system. The Ming emperors, reacting against the cosmopolitan policies of their Mongol predecessors, implemented more restrictive foreign trade policies. They limited foreign merchants' access to Chinese markets and reduced the official support that had previously facilitated international commerce. This isolationist trend made it more difficult for foreign traders to obtain the Chinese goods that had been central to Silk Road commerce for over a millennium. The bubonic plague, which spread along Silk Road routes during the 14th century, devastated populations throughout Eurasia and severely disrupted trade networks. Cities that had served as crucial commercial centers for centuries saw their populations decimated, while the fear of contagion made merchants reluctant to travel traditional routes. The economic and demographic recovery from these plague outbreaks took generations, during which alternative trade routes became more attractive. Climate change during the Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century, made travel across Central Asian routes more difficult and dangerous. Harsher winters, unpredictable weather patterns, and increased precipitation in some regions, while others experienced severe droughts, all contributed to making overland travel more challenging. These environmental changes particularly affected the delicate oasis ecosystems that had sustained Silk Road commerce for centuries. The technological innovations that enabled long-distance maritime navigation represented the most significant challenge to traditional Silk Road commerce. The development of improved compass technology, more accurate maps, and better ship designs made oceanic voyages safer and more profitable than they had ever been before. These maritime technologies had ironically originated in China and spread westward along the Silk Road itself, but their ultimate application would undermine the very trade system that had facilitated their transmission. Portuguese maritime expeditions around Africa during the 15th century demonstrated that European merchants could reach Asian markets without relying on overland routes through the Middle East and Central Asia. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India in 1498 established direct maritime connections between Europe and Asia that bypassed traditional Silk Road intermediaries entirely. These new sea routes offered several advantages over overland alternatives. They were faster, could accommodate larger cargo volumes, and avoided the political complications and taxation burdens associated with crossing multiple territorial boundaries. The establishment of Portuguese trading posts in India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China created alternative commercial networks that competed directly with traditional Silk Road commerce. These maritime networks could transport bulk commodities like rice, timber, and metals that had been impractical to carry across overland routes. They also offered more direct connections between producers and consumers, eliminating many of the intermediary transactions that had characterized traditional Silk Road trade. Spanish colonial expansion in the Americas created entirely new sources of precious metals that flooded global markets and altered traditional trade patterns. The massive quantities of silver extracted from American mines provided European merchants with the means to purchase Asian goods directly, reducing their dependence on complex barter arrangements and credit systems that had developed along traditional Silk Road routes. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, represented a new form of commercial organization that was specifically designed to exploit maritime trade opportunities. This joint stock company could mobilize capital resources and coordinate commercial activities on a scale that individual merchants or traditional trading partnerships could not match. The success of the Dutch East India Company and similar organizations demonstrated the commercial advantages of maritime trade networks over traditional overland routes. However, the decline of traditional Silk Road commerce didn't mean the complete abandonment of overland trade routes between Europe and Asia. Regional trade networks continued to operate along segments of the traditional routes, connecting local markets and facilitating commerce in goods that were better suited to overland transportation. The fur trade, in particular, continued to use overland routes through Central Asia and Siberia, long after maritime routes had captured most intercontinental commerce. The cities that had flourished as Silk Road commercial centers faced varying fates as global trade patterns shifted toward maritime routes. Some, like Istanbul and Aleppo, successfully adapted by becoming centers for regional trade and manufacturing, while maintaining some connections to long-distance commerce. Others, particularly the oasis cities of Central Asia, experienced significant economic decline as the caravans that had sustained their prosperity for centuries became increasingly rare. Samarkand, which had been one of the greatest commercial centers of the medieval world, gradually transformed from an international trading hub into a regional market town. The magnificent architectural monuments built during its golden age remained as testimony to its former importance, but the bustling international bazaars that had once filled its streets became memories preserved in travelers' accounts and historical chronicles. The Safavid Empire in Persia attempted to maintain some elements of traditional Silk Road commerce by developing alternative routes that bypassed Ottoman territories. Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629, actively promoted trade with European merchants and attempted to revive overland commerce through diplomatic and commercial initiatives. However, these efforts could not compete with the advantages offered by maritime alternatives. The intellectual and cultural exchanges that had characterized Silk Road civilization also declined as overland trade networks lost their importance. The cosmopolitan cities that had served as meeting places for scholars, artists, and intellectuals from diverse cultural backgrounds became more isolated and provincial. The synthesis of knowledge and artistic traditions that had flourished in Silk Road centers gradually gave way to more localized cultural developments. Yet the legacy of Silk Road cultural exchanges continued to influence civilizations long after the trade routes themselves had lost their commercial importance. The technologies, artistic techniques, philosophical ideas, and scientific knowledge that had spread along these routes had become permanently integrated into the civilizations that had received them. The printing press, gunpowder, compass navigation, and countless other innovations continued to drive historical developments long after their transmission routes had been abandoned. The Russian expansion across Siberia during the 16th and 17th centuries created new overland connections between Europe and Asia. But these northern routes served different purposes than the traditional Silk Road. The Trans-Siberian fur trade focused on extracting and transporting animal pelts, rather than facilitating the exchange of manufactured goods and luxury items that had characterized classical Silk Road commerce. Chinese attempts to revive overland trade connections during the Maiwei Qing dynasty period met with limited success. The Qing emperors, particularly during the 18th century, attempted to reassert Chinese influence in Central Asia and restore some of the commercial connections that had linked China with Western markets. However, these efforts faced competition from well-established maritime trade networks that offered superior economic advantages. The British East India Company's dominance of Asian trade during the 18th and 19th centuries represented the complete triumph of maritime commerce over traditional overland routes. British control of Indian Ocean trade routes, combined with their growing influence in China through the port of Canton, created commercial networks that made traditional Silk Road routes economically obsolete for most types of international trade. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Silk Road cities provides poignant testimony to the gradual decline of these once thriving commercial centers. Excavations at sites like Nia, Lulan, and other oasis settlements reveal the slow process of abandonment as water sources dried up, trade routes shifted, and economic opportunities disappeared. These archaeological sites preserve the material culture of Silk Road civilization while bearing witness to its ultimate fate. The romantic legend of the Silk Road, which has captured imaginations for centuries, often obscures the practical economic realities that led to its decline. While modern observers may romanticize the cultural exchanges and exotic adventures associated with Silk Road travel, the merchants and governments of the early modern period made rational economic decisions based on costs, risks, and opportunities. Maritime routes simply offered better business prospects than traditional overland alternatives. The transformation of global trade patterns during the early modern period represents one of history's most significant economic revolutions. The shift from overland to maritime commerce not only altered specific trade routes, but also changed the fundamental structure of international economic relationships. Coastal regions gained importance at the expense of inland areas. Maritime powers replaced land-based empires as dominant forces in international trade, and new forms of commercial organization emerged to exploit maritime opportunities. The cultural legacy of the Silk Road extends far beyond its role as a commercial network, encompassing profound influences on art, architecture, religion, science, technology, and cuisine that continue to shape our world today. Even as the traditional overland trade routes faded into historical memory, the cultural synthesis that had developed over more than a millennium of exchange continued to evolve and influence civilizations across Eurasia. Understanding this legacy requires examining both the specific cultural artifacts that survive from the Silk Road period and the ongoing processes of cultural exchange that the historical routes established. The architectural heritage of the Silk Road represents one of its most visible and enduring legacies. From the Buddhist cave temples of Dunhuang to the Islamic monuments of Samarkand, from the Christian churches of Central Asia to the Zoroastrian fire temples scattered across the Iranian plateau, the built environment of former Silk Road cities preserves evidence of the remarkable religious and cultural diversity that characterize these trade routes. These architectural monuments demonstrate how different cultural traditions influenced each other through centuries of interaction and exchange. The Mogao Caves near Dunhuang, carved into cliff faces over a period of nearly 1,000 years, contain some of the world's finest examples of Buddhist art and serve as a unique record of cultural exchange along the Silk Road. The hundreds of cave temples contain paintings and sculptures that reflect influences from Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese artistic traditions, showing how Buddhist art evolved as it spread along the trade routes. The discovery of the sealed library cave in 1900, containing thousands of manuscripts in multiple languages and scripts, provided scholars with unprecedented insights into Silk Road civilization. The manuscripts found in the Dunhuang Library Cave reveal the multilingual nature of Silk Road society and the complex processes of cultural translation that occurred along the trade routes. Documents written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Turkish, and other languages demonstrate how different communities maintained their distinct identities while participating in shared commercial and cultural networks. The presence of Christian, Manichaean, and other religious texts alongside Buddhist and Confucian works illustrates the religious tolerance that characterized many Silk Road communities. The culinary legacy of the Silk Road continues to influence food cultures across Eurasia today. The exchange of crops, spices, and cooking techniques along the trade routes created fusion cuisines that combined elements from multiple culinary traditions. Noodles, which may have been invented independently in both China and the Mediterranean region, were refined and varied through Silk Road exchanges. The spice trade introduced aromatic seasonings to new markets, fundamentally altering the flavor profiles of regional cuisines from Europe to East Asia. Tea culture, which originated in China, spread along Silk Road routes to become an integral part of social life in Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The development of different tea preparation methods and associated social customs reflects the adaptation of Chinese tea culture to local preferences and social structures. The famous Tea Horse Road through Tibet and southwest China represented a specialized branch of Silk Road commerce that continued long after the main routes had declined. The transmission of agricultural crops along Silk Road routes had profound impacts on food security and population growth across Eurasia. Crops like rice, wheat, cotton, and various fruits and vegetables spread to new regions where they became staple foods or important commercial crops. The introduction of New World crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and corn through later trade connections built upon the established patterns of agricultural exchange that had characterized the historical Silk Road. The scientific and technological legacy of the Silk Road includes fundamental innovations that transformed human civilization. The spread of paper-making technology from China revolutionized communication and record-keeping throughout the world, making possible the preservation and transmission of knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Printing technology, also originating in China, eventually reached Europe, where it triggered the intellectual revolution associated with the Renaissance and Reformation. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge transmitted along Silk Road routes contributed to advances in navigation, architecture, and scientific understanding. The numeral system that Europeans call Arabic numerals actually originated in India and reached Europe through Islamic intermediaries who had encountered it through Silk Road connections. Similarly, astronomical observations and mathematical techniques developed in one region were refined and improved through contact with scholars from other traditions. The medical knowledge that circulated along Silk Road networks created synthetic healing traditions that combined therapeutic approaches from multiple cultures. Traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda from India, Greek humoral theory, and various folk healing traditions were all transmitted and adapted through Silk Road connections. Modern integrative medicine approaches that combine elements from different healing traditions can trace their philosophical foundations to these ancient cross-cultural exchanges. the religious syncretism that developed along Silk Road routes created unique spiritual traditions that blended elements from different faith systems. The Buddhist art of Gandhara, which combined Greek sculptural techniques with Buddhist iconography, represents one of the most famous examples of this religious synthesis. Similarly, the various forms of Christianity that developed in Central Asia incorporated local cultural elements while maintaining connections to broader Christian communities. The linguistic legacy of the Silk Road includes the development of trade languages and the transmission of scripts and writing systems across cultural boundaries. The Sogdian language served as a lingua franca for much of Central Asian commerce, while various scripts were adapted to write different languages as they spread along the trade routes. The Arabic script, for example, was adapted to write Persian, Turkish, and various Central Asian languages, creating a shared literary culture across diverse ethnic communities. The artistic legacy of the Silk Road encompasses not only specific artworks, but also the aesthetic sensibilities and decorative motifs that spread between cultures. Chinese landscape painting techniques influenced Persian miniature painting, while Islamic geometric patterns appeared in Chinese decorative arts. The synthesis of artistic traditions created new aesthetic vocabularies that enriched the cultural heritage of all participating civilizations. Modern attempts to revive Silk Road connections began in the late 20th century as improved transportation and communication technologies made overland trade between Europe and Asia practical once again. The collapse of the Soviet Union opened Central Asian routes that had been closed for decades, while China's economic reforms created new opportunities for international trade and cultural exchange. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, represents the most ambitious modern attempt to recreate the connectivity that characterized the historical Silk Road. This massive infrastructure development program aims to build transportation links, energy pipelines, and communication networks that will facilitate trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. While the modern initiative focuses on contemporary economic and political objectives, it explicitly draws inspiration from the historical Silk Road's legacy of connecting diverse civilizations through commerce and cultural exchange. The modern revival of interest in Silk Road history has been facilitated by archaeological discoveries, scholarly research, and cultural exchange programs that have revealed new aspects of this ancient commercial network. International cooperation in preserving Silk Road cultural heritage sites has created opportunities for scholars from different countries to collaborate in understanding their shared historical legacy. Tourism along historical Silk Road routes has become an important economic activity for many Central Asian countries, providing incentives for preserving historical sites and maintaining cultural traditions associated with the ancient trade routes. Modern travelers following Silk Road routes experience echoes of the cultural diversity and cross-cultural exchange that characterize these ancient pathways, though under very different circumstances than their historical predecessors. The digital age has created new possibilities for cultural exchange that parallel some aspects of historical Silk Road connections. Modern communication technologies enable instant connections between distant communities, facilitating cultural and intellectual exchanges that would have taken months or years to accomplish using traditional Silk Road routes. However, these digital connections operate within different cultural and economic contexts than those that characterize the historical trade networks. Educational institutions across former Silk Road regions have developed programs that explore their shared historical heritage and promote contemporary cultural exchange. Universities in China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe collaborate on research projects that investigate Silk Road history while building new forms of international cooperation. These academic connections continue the intellectual exchange, traditions that characterized historical Silk Road civilization. The environmental legacy of the Silk Road includes both positive and negative aspects that continue to influence contemporary environmental conditions. The introduction of new crops and agricultural techniques along the trade routes increased agricultural productivity in many regions, but overuse of water resources in some oasis communities contributed to environmental degradation that persists today. Understanding these historical environmental impacts provides insights for contemporary sustainability efforts. Climate change research has revealed connections between historical climate variations and the rise and decline of Silk Road trade routes. Periods of favorable climate conditions facilitated trade expansion, while environmental challenges contributed to route abandonment and urban decline. These historical examples provide valuable data for understanding how contemporary climate changes might affect economic and social systems. The multicultural heritage of former Silk Road regions continues to influence contemporary political and social developments. The ethnic and religious diversity that developed through centuries of Silk Road connections created complex identity patterns that persist in modern nation-states. Understanding this historical diversity provides important context for contemporary political developments in Central Asia and other former Silk Road regions. Cultural preservation efforts in former Silk Road regions face challenges from modernization, urbanization, and political changes, but they also benefit from international support and recognition of the universal value of Silk Road cultural heritage. UNESCO World Heritage designations for important Silk Road sites have helped protect these cultural treasures while promoting international cooperation in their preservation. The scholarly study of Silk Road history continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries, documentary sources, and analytical techniques reveal previously unknown aspects of these ancient trade networks. International scholarly conferences, collaborative research projects, and digital humanities initiatives are creating new understandings of how the Silk Road operated and what its legacy means for contemporary global civilization. The legend and reality of the Silk Road continue to capture popular imagination through literature, films, documentaries, and other media that explore its romantic associations with adventure, cultural exchange, and exotic trade. While these popular representations sometimes romanticize or oversimplify historical realities, they also help maintain public interest in the historical significance of these ancient connections between East and West. As we reach the end of our journey through the history of the Silk Road, we find ourselves contemplating not just the end of a story, but the transformation of one chapter of human connectivity into another. The ancient pathways that once carried silk, spices, precious stones, and revolutionary ideas across the vast expanses of Eurasia have not truly disappeared. They have evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in our interconnected modern world. The Silk Road was never simply about the movement of goods from one place to another. It was about the fundamental human drive to connect, to explore, to share, and to learn from one another across the barriers of distance, language, and culture. The merchants who risked their lives crossing the Taklamakan Desert, the scholars who translated texts in the House of Wisdom, the artisans who created fusion styles that blended traditions from multiple civilizations, all of these individuals were participating in a grand human project of connection and exchange that continues Today, in different forms, the legacy of the Silk Road lives on in every cup of tea served in a London cafe. Every mathematical equation that uses the numeral system transmitted from India through Islamic lands to Europe. Every smartphone that connects people across continents in seconds, rather than the months required for ancient caravans. The spirit of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and peaceful commerce that characterize the best aspects of Silk Road civilization continues to inspire modern efforts at international cooperation and mutual understanding. Yet the challenges that faced Silk Road merchants and communities also find echoes in our contemporary world. Political instability, economic inequality, environmental degradation, and cultural misunderstanding continue to threaten the connections that bind human societies together. The lessons learned from both the successes and failures of Silk Road civilization provide valuable insights for addressing these contemporary challenges. The Silk Road teaches us that cultural diversity and economic exchange can be mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. The most prosperous and innovative Silk Road cities were those that welcomed merchants, scholars, and artisans from diverse backgrounds, creating cosmopolitan environments where different traditions could interact and synthesize. This historical lesson remains relevant for contemporary societies grappling with questions of immigration, cultural identity, and global integration. The environmental history of the Silk Road also provides important lessons for our climate-conscious age. The rise and fall of oasis cities, the impact of climate change on trade routes, and the relationship between economic activity and environmental sustainability all offer historical perspectives that can inform contemporary environmental policy and planning. As we consider the future of global connectivity, the Silk Road reminds us that technology alone is not sufficient to create meaningful connections between different peoples and cultures. The ancient trade routes succeeded not just because of innovations in transportation and communication, but because they fostered human relationships built on trust, mutual respect, and shared interests. These human elements remain essential for creating sustainable global connections in our modern world. The Belt and Road Initiative and other contemporary efforts to recreate Silk Road connectivity will succeed only if they capture not just the commercial aspects of the historical trade routes, but also their spirit of cultural exchange and mutual learning. Modern infrastructure projects can create the physical foundations for increased connectivity, but lasting success will depend on fostering the same kinds of human relationships that made the ancient Silk Road a transformative force in world history. The story of the Silk Road ultimately reminds us that human civilization has always been global in scope, connected across vast distances by networks of trade, cultural exchange, and intellectual collaboration. The modern world's interconnectedness is not a new phenomenon, but rather the latest chapter in a story that began thousands of years ago when the first merchants decided to venture beyond their familiar territories in search of new opportunities and connections. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself as one of those ancient travelers, resting in a caravanserai under the star-filled desert sky, surrounded by fellow travelers speaking different languages but united by their shared journey across the ancient highways of human connection. The Silk Road continues in the connections we make, the ideas we share, and the bridges we build between cultures and communities around the world. The eternal journey of human connection that began on the dusty tracks of ancient trade routes continues today and forms that the first Silk Road merchants could never have imagined, but with the same fundamental spirit of exploration, exchange, and mutual understanding that made their journeys possible. In this sense, we are all travelers on the Silk Road, carrying forward the legacy of those who came before us while creating new pathways for those who will follow. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, and may your journeys be filled with the same wonder, discovery, and connection that characterize the greatest adventure in human history, the Silk Road.